November 1945. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg was no longer a courthouse. It was a controlled environment. Every corridor, every room, every filing cabinet had been repurposed into a single function: narrative containment. Publicly, the International Military Tribunal was presented as an open reckoning. The world was told this would be the moment when law replaced vengeance, when evidence replaced rumor, when history would be written in documents rather than memory. Cameras were allowed. Journalists were invited. Transcripts were promised. Privately, something very different was happening. Before the first defendant entered the courtroom, Allied legal teams had already spent months deciding what kind of truth would be permitted. Not whether the Nazis were guilty. That was never in doubt. The real question was scope. How wide the lens could go before it stopped serving Allied interests. This was not theoretical. It was procedural. By the summer of 1945, Allied intelligence agencies were drowning in captured material: train manifests, industrial contracts, banking ledgers, diplomatic cables, intelligence contact reports. Entire ministries had collapsed intact. Germany had not burned its archives the way myths later claimed. In many cases, clerks simply fled, leaving filing cabinets unlocked. The problem was not a lack of evidence. The problem was too much of it. Early drafts of the prosecution strategy reveal a quiet panic. If everything was introduced, the trial would never end. Worse, it would drift. The focus would move away from individual criminal responsibility and towards systems, networks, financial conduits, diplomatic tolerances, pre-war accommodations, wartime compromises. Those were dangerous territories. Because once the courtroom began asking how the Nazi state functioned, the next question became unavoidable. Who else interacted with those functions knowingly and repeatedly before and during the war? That was the line the tribunal could not cross, so limits were imposed, not announced, not debated publicly, but enforced through evidentiary rules, prosecutorial discretion, and classification stamps. From the beginning, the trial was designed to look exhaustive while remaining selective. Only crimes that could be proven entirely inside the German chain of command were encouraged. Anything that hinted at external facilitation was labeled contextual, then quietly excluded. This is why certain themes dominate Nuremberg transcripts, while others are strangely absent. You hear endless detail about orders, decrees, and camps. You hear almost nothing about banking mechanisms, almost nothing about neutral state logistics, almost nothing about intelligence backchannels that did not fit neatly into the Axis versus Allies binary. It wasn't that prosecutors didn't know, they knew very well. Internal correspondence between Allied legal offices shows repeated concern about spillover. That was the term they used. Spillover meant evidence that did not stop where it was supposed to. Evidence that bled outward, implicating institutions that the post-war world needed intact. The tribunal's mandate was justice, yes, but it was also stabilization. Europe was shattered. Governments were collapsing. New alliances were forming overnight. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally of convenience, but an emerging adversary. The last thing the Western Allies wanted was a trial that destabilized neutral financial centers, embarrassed intelligence agencies, or raised questions about wartime moral trade-offs. So the frame was tightened. Crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These categories were broad enough to condemn the Nazi leadership, but narrow enough to prevent inquiry into how deeply entangled the wider world had been with the German war economy before 1939, and how cautiously it had sometimes dealt with it afterward. By the time the courtroom lights came on, the shape of the truth had already been carved. What followed was not a lie, but it was a curated truth. And the files that didn't fit that curation never made it past the antechambers of the tribunal. They sat in side offices. They were stamped, indexed, and sealed. They were marked for postwar review, a phrase that often meant never. The world watched Nuremberg believing it was seeing the full record. It wasn't. It was seeing the version of the record that the victors believed the world could safely absorb. Before we go any further, one thing matters. If you want more history pulled from sealed files, internal memoranda, and evidence that never made it into official courtrooms, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel exists for the material that was judged too sensitive, too inconvenient, or too destabilizing to be shown the first time. Now, back to the files. By the time the tribunal opened, Allied investigators already knew that the story of Nazi gold was far more complicated than the public version suggested. The public narrative was clean. Gold looted from occupied Europe. Gold stripped from victims. Gold hidden, then recovered. That version was true, but it was incomplete. What sat in Allied intelligence vaults were not just lists of stolen valuables, but movement records, timelines, routing sheets, banking correspondence, insurance documentation, clearing arrangements. These were not battlefield artifacts, they were financial instruments, and they showed something deeply uncomfortable. The Nazi financial system did not collapse when the bombs fell. It adapted. As early as 1942, German planners understood that defeat was possible, not inevitable, but plausible. From that moment forward, a parallel effort began, quiet, technical, bureaucratic, to preserve value beyond the Reich's lifespan. Gold was central to that effort, but not in the way propaganda later suggested. This was not about burying crates in forests. It was about conversion. Raw gold was converted into standardized bars. Bars were restamped. Serial numbers were altered or removed. Documentation was fragmented across jurisdictions. Most critically, transfers were routed through countries that were not at war. Neutral states were not passive conduits. They were active filters. They provided legitimacy. When gold entered certain banking systems, it did not look stolen anymore. It looked cleared. Once cleared, it could be exchanged, insured, or collateralized. Allied intelligence knew this. By 1944, analysts had already reconstructed several transfer chains. They could trace specific shipments from German vaults into foreign institutions, then onward into commercial circulation. The problem was not proving this happened. The problem was explaining why nothing had stopped it. Some transfers occurred while Allied diplomats were still negotiating trade access with those same neutral governments. Others occurred while Allied intelligence services were monitoring the flows but choosing observation over intervention. Introducing these records at Nuremberg would have forced prosecutors to answer questions they were not prepared to face in open court. Why were certain banks investigated quietly but never named publicly? Why were some executives interviewed as witnesses rather than suspects? Why were entire countries described as cooperative, despite documented facilitation? The tribunal had no jurisdiction over neutral states. That was the official reason these files were excluded, but jurisdiction was only part of the story. The deeper issue was consequence. If these gold trails were presented in detail, the trial would no longer be about Nazi criminality alone. It would become a referendum on wartime pragmatism, on moral compromise, on the price of maintaining fragile alliances and post-war economic stability. The Allies were already planning reconstruction. They needed functioning financial centers. They needed currencies to hold value. They needed trust, however artificial, to return quickly. Dragging major banking institutions into a war crimes tribunal would have detonated that plan. So the files were categorized. Some were labeled background intelligence. Some were designated policy sensitive. Some were marked informational only. None were destroyed, but none were read aloud in court. What the world heard instead was a simplified story. Gold as loot, gold as plunder, gold as evidence of cruelty. What it did not hear was gold as infrastructure, gold as diplomacy, gold as leverage. The tribunal convicted men. It did not indict systems, and in doing so, it left one of the most consequential mechanisms of the Nazi war effort, largely untouched by public judgment. Those mechanisms survived the Reich, and some of the institutions that handled them survived too, unchanged, respected, and integrated into the post-war order. If the gold files threatened embarrassment, the intelligence files threatened collapse. By 1945, Allied intelligence agencies were sitting on an archive unlike anything they had ever possessed before. Not just captured German records, but cross-reference material, intercepts matched to human source reports, diplomatic cables aligned with financial movements, names appearing in multiple contexts, across years, across borders. What emerged from that mass of paper was not a simple picture of isolation. It was a picture of contact. Before the war and in the early years of it, Nazi officials did not operate in a vacuum. They probed, they tested, they communicated, sometimes openly through diplomatic channels, sometimes indirectly through intermediaries who specialized in ambiguity, businessmen, lawyers, intelligence cutouts, neutral diplomats who carried messages without formally acknowledging them. All of this was documented, not speculated, documented. The files showed meetings that were never supposed to matter later, conversations framed as exploratory, exchanges labeled informational, contacts that produced no immediate agreement, but established familiarity. Those contacts became radioactive after 1939. Because once war began, acknowledging them raised a dangerous implication that the Nazi state had not always been treated as a pariah, even after its intentions were clear. Allied intelligence understood this problem early. During the war itself, analysts were instructed to distinguish between hostile contacts and historic contacts. The language mattered. Historic contacts were those that occurred before formal hostilities or during periods of diplomatic uncertainty. They were not illegal, they were not criminal, but they were politically toxic. At Nuremberg, defense attorneys sensed this vulnerability almost immediately. They did not deny crimes. That would have been futile. Instead, they attempted something more subtle. They tried to widen the frame, to suggest that Germany's leadership had operated within a broader international environment that tolerated, engaged, and sometimes facilitated its rise. Every attempt failed. Whenever the defense tried to introduce evidence involving foreign intelligence services, neutral state intermediaries, or pre-war diplomatic signaling, prosecutors objected. Judges sustained those objections with remarkable consistency. The reasoning was procedural. The tribunal, they said, was not concerned with the actions of other nations. It existed solely to judge German defendants. That reasoning was legally defensible. It was also strategically essential, because intelligence files do not stay neatly contained. Once one is introduced, it demands context. Context demands corroboration. Corroboration demands witnesses. And witnesses, inevitably, would have included people the Allies had no intention of putting under oath. Some of those individuals were still active, some were still valuable, some were embedded in the very intelligence services now prosecuting the case. Introducing those files would not have just complicated the trial, it would have exposed the continuity between pre-war intelligence maneuvering and post-war power structures. So a firewall was erected. Anything that suggested mutual awareness before 1939 was excluded. Anything that implied negotiation rather than confrontation was deemed irrelevant. Anything that risked blurring the moral line between aggressor and observer was ruled inadmissible. The result was a courtroom narrative in which Nazi criminality appeared to erupt fully formed, detached from the diplomatic and intelligence ecosystem that had surrounded it during its rise. This was not accidental. It was a design choice. The Allies needed a clean moral break. They needed a story in which Nazism stood alone, condemned by a united world that had always recognized it for what it was. The intelligence files said otherwise. They showed hesitation. They showed miscalculation. They showed moments where containment was preferred over confrontation and engagement over rupture. Those moments did not excuse crimes, but they complicated the story, and complication was the enemy of legitimacy. So the files were sealed, not destroyed, not denied, just postponed. Decades later, when fragments surfaced, historians noticed something strange. The documents did not contradict the verdicts. They contradicted the simplicity of the narrative. At Nuremberg, simplicity won. From the outside, the Nuremberg courtroom looked like a place of confrontation. Prosecutors and defense attorneys faced each other beneath bright lights, surrounded by judges, guards, translators, and cameras. It felt adversarial. It felt open. It wasn't. By the time testimony began, the boundaries of acceptable argument had already been fixed, not through speeches or rulings announced to the press, but through procedure, through what could be filed, what could be referenced, what could be asked without interruption. The most powerful tool was not censorship, it was relevance. Imagine a defense attorney standing to question a witness. He doesn't deny the existence of camps. He doesn't deny the brutality of occupation. Instead, he asks a different kind of question, one about context, one about knowledge, one about how early warnings were handled outside Germany. The prosecutor rises immediately. The objection is calm, technical, polite, not relevant to the charges before the tribunal. And the judge agrees, again and again and again. Over time, defense teams learned the pattern. They stopped trying to introduce certain documents because they already knew the outcome. Entire lines of inquiry died before they were spoken aloud. This is how exclusion works at the highest level. Not through dramatic suppression, but through repetition, through predictability, through the quiet understanding that some doors simply do not open. The tribunal's charter made this possible. It defined crimes in a way that centered intent and command responsibility within the German state. That definition was legally innovative and strategically precise. It meant that anything outside the German chain of command could be ruled tangential, helpful for historians perhaps, but irrelevant to guilt. This allowed prosecutors to do something very specific. They could present a mountain of evidence while still avoiding certain questions entirely. Why did warnings go unheeded in the early 1930s? Why did economic engagement continue after aggression was clear? Why were some channels kept open even as others closed? These were not forbidden questions in principle. They were simply ruled out of scope. The defense understood what was happening. In private notes and correspondence, some defense lawyers expressed frustration that the trial was not about truth in its fullest sense, but about responsibility as narrowly defined by the victors. They were not wrong, but they were also powerless. The judges were not neutral arbiters in the modern sense. They were representatives of victorious states, operating under a mandate shaped by political necessity. That necessity demanded a verdict that would stand, not one that would destabilize the post-war order. Every time the defense attempted to widen the frame, they collided with that reality. The most telling moments came when defendants themselves tried to speak beyond the script. Several attempted to describe their actions as part of a larger international environment. They spoke of pressures, expectations, signals received and interpreted. They hinted carefully at conversations and assumptions that predated the war. Their statements were cut short. Judges reminded them to answer the question asked. Translators were instructed to keep responses concise. Prosecutors redirected testimony back to orders, signatures, and dates. The message was unmistakable. This trial was not about how the world arrived at catastrophe. It was about assigning blame for committing it. That distinction mattered because by the end of the proceedings, the historical record would reflect exactly what the courtroom had allowed it to reflect. Crimes would be individualized. Responsibility would be localized. The broader ecosystem that enabled those crimes would remain largely invisible. That invisibility was not accidental. It was the product of rules written to produce a specific kind of truth, one that could punish but not implicate. And once those rules were accepted, everything else followed naturally. When the verdicts were read, the world believed the story was finished. Sentences were handed down. Executions followed. Prisons closed their doors. Publicly, Nuremberg was presented as a conclusion, the legal end of the Nazi era. Privately, it marked the beginning of something else, archival control. Within weeks of the final judgments, Allied legal offices shifted focus. Courtrooms emptied, cameras were packed away. Attention moved from prosecution to preservation. Files were sorted, boxed, and reassigned new classifications. This was not a chaotic process. It was meticulous. Documents that had been introduced in court were prepared for publication. Transcripts were edited. Exhibits were cataloged for historians. This material would form the official record, cited for decades as definitive proof. But alongside it existed a second archive. This archive contained everything that had never been spoken aloud: financial intelligence summaries, diplomatic contact reports, interagency memoranda debating risk and exposure, lists of names that had appeared often enough to be noticed, but not often enough to be indicted. These files were not destroyed because they still had value. They explained too much. As the political climate shifted almost overnight, the logic for silence hardened. By 1946, the wartime alliance had fractured. The Soviet Union was no longer a partner, but a rival. Western governments were no longer focused on punishment alone. They were focused on containment. In that environment, the last thing policymakers wanted was renewed scrutiny of pre-war compromises or wartime gray zones. Moral clarity had become a strategic asset. It simplified alliances. It justified policies. It stabilized populations exhausted by years of conflict. So silence was institutionalized. Archives were sealed for fixed periods, 10 years, 25 years, sometimes longer. Others were restricted indefinitely under national security exemptions that were never clearly defined. The justification was always forward-looking. Releasing this material could damage diplomatic relations. It could undermine trust in financial systems. It could expose intelligence methods still in use. All of those arguments were technically true. They were also incredibly convenient, because the longer the silence lasted, the easier it became to treat absence as insignificance. If a document was never cited, it could be ignored. If a topic was never discussed, it could be assumed irrelevant. By the time partial declassifications began decades later, the narrative had already hardened. Textbooks had been written. Films had been made. Public memory had settled. The fragments that emerged told a consistent story, not of innocence elsewhere, but of selective illumination. Historians noticed patterns. Entire categories of documentation appeared thinner than expected. References jumped abruptly from one period to another. Footnotes pointed to files that remained inaccessible, even when surrounding material was open. What was missing was not random: finance, neutral facilitation, intelligence overlap. The same themes that had been excluded from the courtroom were now absent from the archive. By then, the reason barely mattered. The Cold War had begun. New enemies required old certainties. And so the silence held. Not because the truth would have changed the verdicts, but because it might have changed how the victors themselves were understood. Nuremberg did something no court had ever done before. It transformed mass atrocity into legal precedent. It established that state power did not place individuals beyond judgment. It created a language, crimes against humanity, that still shapes international law. None of that is false, but none of it is complete. Because Nuremberg was never designed to answer every question raised by the war. It was designed to answer the questions that could be answered without destabilizing the future. That constraint shaped everything. The trial isolated criminal intent inside the Nazi leadership and sealed it there. Orders flowed downward. Responsibility flowed upward. The system was presented as self-contained, pathological, and uniquely German. That framing was powerful. It was also protective. It protected post-war alliances from scrutiny. It protected financial systems from disruption. It protected intelligence services from exposure. It protected the idea that the world had stood clearly against Nazism from the start. The files that never entered the courtroom threatened that clarity. They showed that before 1939, the world hesitated. They showed that during the war, the world compromised. They showed that after the war, the world prioritized stability over total transparency. Those facts do not dilute Nazi guilt. They complicate Allied innocence. And that complication was judged unacceptable. So the record was shaped, not falsified, not fabricated, but edited. Justice was delivered in a form that could be sustained politically, economically, and strategically. The rest was deferred, sometimes for decades, sometimes indefinitely. This is why the missing files matter, not because they would overturn verdicts, not because they would exonerate anyone, but because they reveal how power manages truth in moments of transition. Nuremberg was not just a trial, it was a handover. From war to order, from chaos to structure, from violence to narrative. And narratives, once established, are remarkably durable. They decide what gets taught. They decide what gets remembered. They decide what questions future generations think are worth asking. The files that stayed sealed remind us of something uncomfortable. History is not only written by the victors, it is curated by them. And sometimes the most important evidence is not what was shown, but what was deemed too risky to reveal. If this story felt incomplete, that's because it was designed to be. History doesn't end where the documents stop. It ends where someone decides to stop showing them. At WW2 Declassified, we don't retell victories. We reopen files. Files that were sealed. Arguments that were ruled out of scope. Evidence that never reached a microphone. If you want more investigations like this, pulled from buried archives, suppressed transcripts, and the margins of official history, subscribe now. Because the most important truths of World War II weren't destroyed, they were filed away, and we're opening them, one folder at a time.